Hello everybody, welcome to the third edition of our webinar Wednesday. Today we'll have a webinar about multi-echelon inventory management. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. You might also know me as the Editor-in-Chief of the European Quarterly Supply Chain Movement, with a large community around the world, and especially in Europe. So welcome to you all. We have an interesting webinar coming up, and afterwards we have also an interactive session in a lounge, so you can talk to us directly. But first, I'm gonna introduce you to my experts. So you see me on the left. I'm Martin Loffers, as I said, Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. I will be the moderator. And to the right, in the middle, you see Jonathan Jackman of Agility. Jonathan, hi.
Hi, Martin. Pleased to be here. Really great topic today. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
All right. And next with Gökhan, also from Agility, expert on optimization, and inventory management. Gökhan, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Gökhan, welcome.
Did we lose you, Gökhan?
He is in the broadcast. So we'll pick it up. He will joining. But first of all, this webinar will be recorded, and the PDF or the PowerPoint will be made available as PDF afterwards. So probably in the next 48 hours. You can start ask questions right away. You see on the right-hand side, you see a chat function, that is to say hi to everybody or whatever. And you see a question mark on the right. So that's the environment where you can start questions. And later on, at the end of the Q&A, last week we talked about blockchain, and at the end we were bombarded with questions. All of a sudden there were 20 questions, and then you can, give thumbs, likes. Then I can see which questions will be the most important in your opinion. But feel free to ask this question along the line during our conversation. So I can also start to ask these questions to Jonathan or Gökhan immediately to keep it interactive. So you have your options to enhance your screen. You see a small button on the upper right corner of the PowerPoint slide. You can enlarge the PowerPoint presentation. We will keep our cameras down, so you can enlarge it if you want to have a closer look to the slides. All right. Why the webinar about multi-echelon inventory optimization? Last year in March, Supply Chain Media did a survey among 142 manufacturing companies and some retailers in the Netherlands and in Europe. And basically what you see, there were several bottlenecks, and you saw inbound flow of raw material, the physical goods. But on the second one, lack of demand visibility. So that was a major part, visibility. And also the fifth one, also on the supply side, you saw a lack of visibility in its supply chain. So that were major bottlenecks. So we will talk about visibility also today related to inventory. That was in March last year, and in June we did another survey, and we asked the companies, where are you going to invest in supply chain software? And not surprisingly enough, a lot of companies said sales and operations planning, S&OP, that was number one. And number two was end-to-end supply chain visibility. And if you can see, the orange bars are the companies that are claiming to be more advanced in supply chain management, more mature, I would say. So they have a level 4 or 5 according to the Gartner 1 to 5 scale of maturity. And the overall response are in blue. So end-to-end supply chain visibility is the highest investment subject for the leading companies. Jonathan, how do you look at these kind of figures?
Yeah, interesting feedback, Martin. I mean, when we look at the list, no surprises really, actually, given the current times, because we see that all these initiatives, in one way or the other, actually have a direct impact on the topic that we're going to talk today in terms of end-to-end inventory management. So, when you look at this all the way from S&OP through to visibility, production planning, we can see why companies are looking at these areas. They're trying to connect more, they're trying to have more control and become more intelligent in their decision making. So certainly topics that we'll touch on as we go through today.
Yeah, multi-echelon inventory management optimization is not a common, I think, software category yet, I would say. So SOP is. So, that's why we didn't ask specifically about that phrase, but we will get to that. What we do next, we have developed a roadmap about multi-echelon inventory optimization together with Agility, 5 steps. You see the 5 steps here. It's available online. We've posted it in a magazine. We've posted online. And we'll go through these 5 steps. So, Jonathan, Gökhan, step 1, that's probably about how to start a project.
Yeah, let's dive in. It's all about kind of gaining the necessary approvals and resources for transformational projects. So let's just spend a few minutes now on that topic. Just kicking off, Darwin said that the species that are most adaptable to change are the ones that survive. And this is interesting because in most industries, we find that poor service is not just a symptom of forecast error, but it's rather manufacturing and distribution policies being out of alignment. And so therefore not being able to respond to the changes that Darwin references. So an example, specifically around our topic today is how companies are still today operating on what we would call simple end item safety stock policies without connecting the full value chain. So not moving towards that more multi-echelon approach. And so when that happens and things like our demand, our network, our lead times, our commitments change, we need to proactively adapt how we think about inventory. Now, we should kind of start the discussion by grounding ourselves in some of the truths about industry, about inventory, and the recent events, disruptions, industry trends have created large imbalances in inventory and availability. So whilst companies have tried to respond by raising their stock levels, in many cases this has not worked. And when we're seeing fill rates staying below 90%, even though inventories have risen. So, this is a problem. We also know we can't eliminate excess inventories overnight. Products have different velocities in different channels. And at the same time, we're not just going to shut off production entirely. That would be, generally infeasible. So any surplus we do, takes time to work off. And another common thread we hear is that, well, our current planning solution, our current ERP solves this. And really that's just not true. Those kind of solutions have not been architected to deal with the dynamics of business and proactively adjust targets when business changes. So typically these systems will focus on safety stocks in finished goods and not focus on the other forms of inventory as well. So we find these current systems, they lack a sustainable framework to meet the inventory goals and are just not designed to balance service levels with margins or answer the tougher questions that companies have today around inventory. Good news is, with MEIO, this becomes a solvable problem. We need people, process, technology to solve it. We're going to learn about that a bit more today. And when we do solve it, we know that large gains can be expected and achieved once we deploy it. Gökhan, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So using MEIO, or multi-echelon inventory optimization, we perform end-to-end optimization, accounting for the dependencies across the manufacturing and distribution. So for instance, if you change the stocking policy or replenishment frequency, it does change the exposure downstream, as well as it changes the demand pattern seen upstream. So this stuff requires some math. We know that in many industries, companies typically have a pretty good handle on finished goods, but the same optimization may not extend to the upstream operations. So let's talk about the 2 bits of optimization that are typical. One of them is the safety stock placement. The other one could be a push-pull boundary optimization, or how to do the postponement. As I said, it's quite normal that the focus on inventory is typically with the finished goods distribution. But even so, companies that are global, operating in regions, they end up having a complex distribution network and waiting to be rationalized. Typically, this is a 2-step process. On one hand, they could be performing a network optimization to set up the optimum physical assets. And then they could be trying to overlay on top the inventory policy. Now, as we extend the inventory control upstream in the network to the production and sourcing, we see companies applying a rule called sprinkle everywhere. So nobody will get fired for that kind of security, but it is a costly proposition. And when we do perform the optimization, in many instances, we may not be holding stock at every location. Rather, we could be balancing a working capital against the risks to extract the maximum service. This is a very different objective. We could be solving questions about, what is the optimum frozen horizon? Where should I differentiate the stock? How do I secure the supply? How do I minimize the time to recover or even increase the time to survive in the current extreme scenarios? But almost always these approaches change the structure of the inventory, and it requires a deeper collaboration between procurement, manufacturing, distribution, and sales. Now, being able to mitigate the risk, as I mentioned, was one of the objectives we talked about. Let's look at some of the others and see how they map to the MEIO policies. So first and foremost, companies trying to extend their market share, they would need to align their service goals with the product offers. So when we do a new product launch, it needs to be done with the proper priming of the channels. The inventory would have to be located closer to the customers. And this has to be perhaps in the most differentiated form with the shortest lead time available. When we account for all of these facts, on the policies, the working capital is typically higher in these cases. And sometimes this is a really tough one to manage, particularly when the SKU count is large. Things churn rapidly, as well as, we are facing channel pressures. Let's look at the next one, the market protection. Especially for, let's say, configure to order items, we may benefit from lead time reduction as well as offering a wider product options to choose from. This could potentially change the form and the position of the stocks. We would also need to start looking at the balances between the availability and what type of inventory we're holding. And finally, for cost reduction or profit maximization strategies, we could be employing postponement policies, keeping the goods in less differentiated forms across the network. Now, for this one, the customer service expectations need to be aligned with the kind of replenishment and policies that we're kind of baking. Once we have a particular objective chosen, the next step would be creating an alignment between the budgets and financial targets. So if we have a portfolio in scope, we should start with an unconstrained optimization of the service levels. What do I mean by it? Here, we would be trading off the inventory costs versus the cost of not having the stocks. So those could be expediting costs, penalties from customers, missing margins, or a whole bunch of other stuff. We would then overlay these goals against the specific financial objectives as well as the working capital budgets. Again, you need to have a connected network to be able to run these sort of analysis. Finally, we could be thinking about reallocating the stock to new positions, perhaps evaluating a new push-pull boundary to achieve much higher availability at lower cost. And these are possible in the optimization. And this framework then can be repeated when we actually firm up or relax some of the assumptions and perhaps the solution space. Maybe we want to concentrate on a region or a product category or whatever. Now, here's an example for this type of what I call strategic alignment from one of our customers. CLARIOS is the world's largest battery manufacturer for automotive elsewhere. And they do have a truly integrated manufacturing for almost all of their components across North America and Mexico. When we implemented the MEIO solution on the existing policies initially, we saw a very large opportunity to reduce the stock. But as the company is a critical supplier for large automotive brands, the strategy that they've chosen was to opt out and improve the service and redistribute the stock to gain market share. And it was the first time in their history that they had back-to-back perfect orders, and they didn't have to have these kind of tough decisions you would typically have with the OEM customers. And during the COVID, CLARIOS was able to adjust the policies, get forward visibility into the working capital requirements. They were able to, more importantly, gauge the impact on factory utilization scenarios. And I can say that when integrated tactically, these tools are successful in riding through a black swan event like COVID. And they are very successful.
Yeah, great case study. So Martin, early on, we're showing here an example of the value that can be achieved through the MEIO approach.
Okay. Before we go to the next step in our 5-step approach for the roadmap, I have some questions, in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to ask this question along the way. Please use the question mark environment so I can pick it up. Gökhan, Jonathan, MRP is at the heart of a lot of ERP systems, and what I've studied operations research. So MRP has fixed lead times. And sometimes companies have more ERP instances. So isn't that a cause, one of the root causes of the problem that companies, you showed the complex supply chain network, that you can't solve it with MRP or even DDMRP? Gökhan?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the problems, but we're making sure that we have the proper buffers to work around these deterministic lead times. So that's it's a complementary solution over the top of MRP. And to me, actually, we're going to talk about this. One of the litmus tests for me to apply the MEIO is whether the company is running MRP with their own APS systems. Versus running it through Excel spreadsheets. And that means that there's a bit of a confidence on the master data in itself. So this is actually a very good sign for me to apply.
And regarding a DDMRP solution as a alternative for the traditional MRP, is that the way to go?
It depends. DDMRP is a hot topic, and we should also recognize that in the current COVID environment, the demand changes. Having said that, a number of the, concepts apply to MEIO in terms of decoupling the stock is actually very much in line with the DDMRP thinking there. But we just need to watch out. The demand is changing.
And it also depends on the volatility of demand and supply, whether it's applicable to DDMRP or not. I have a question from the audience before we go to the next step. Maybe you will go into that later on. But how do you handle capacity constraints in between the echelons?
That's a great question. We have a very specific safety stock type, knowing full well that when companies are capacitated, you may not be able to reach the inventory position right away. There could be a bit of a laggard, and you could be facing an expected shortage. So if you get that signal, we would like to buffer it up to, again, mitigate that kind of a risk. So there is a specific methodology for that.
Okay. Maybe later on you can also, in the lounge, talk this kind of question to Gökhan. So going over to the next step, Jonathan.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. So next stage, the analogy of the foggy road is quite relevant here, as because MEIO is a cross-functional program, it can seem a little bit of a mystery, almost counterintuitive at first, and we need a framework to kind of help us guide us through that. And this framework's based on value delivery. And we talked about how we can achieve executive buy-in by aligning and executing on specific strategies. But this doesn't happen overnight. And typically, we need to follow an orchestrated value delivery. Now, that starts with an assessment. And that assessment is how well are you performing today compared to the efficient frontier? And this is the mathematical representation of the relationship between the inventory and the target service. And one of the first things we want to do is we actually want to optimize the inventories on the existing supply chain digital twin, end to end. Once we've done that, we would then start looking at some of the short-term opportunities to shift the curve. So do we have the right service? Do we need to redeploy? Should we increase our replenishment frequencies, etc.? And as we start to build confidence, then we could be evaluating some of the medium and longer term initiatives, which you can see highlighted on the right. And they have a profound impact in shifting the curve and actually can be disruptive for the competition as well. So do we use third parties? What's the cost of a VMI program? Can I reduce the lead time, like Gökhan mentioned earlier? But when all said and done, we're looking at some significant gains on reducing the costs, the working capital, increasing the service, and gaining market share all at once. And as we do optimize these plans and propose new targets to be on top of this efficient frontier, we could then be presenting some counterintuitive results to the users. And Gökhan, you've got a great example of that.
Yeah, Jonathan, I've seen those again and again. And here's an example from one of our customers. And it sometimes happens in the products that the planner are most familiar with. So here's an example from Kraft Heinz. It's mac and cheese. It's a high demand, mature product. Typically, these kind of products would have a certain legacy vis-a-vis to the way they have been planned. The product has a long shelf life. It has a very stable demand, very little seasonality, and literally they have decades of data on this one. I mean, actuals, historical forecasts, name it, they have it. And it gets produced consistently with very frequent campaigns. Now, when initial optimization results were disclosed to the planner community, they've seen a massive opportunities, not only on this item, but also on others, A items. And it's typical that these kind of items would run on a weeks of cover target, and they tend to be the most scrutinized items. They also saw that supply was overplanned, and the proposed adjustments, needless to say, it raised a lot of flags and resulted in a lot of objections from the planners. So it's not uncommon to see big impacts on these type of adjustments in terms of cost, availability, and waste, particularly in food and beverage. Here are some of the gains that were achieved with the MEIO implementation in Kraft Heinz in North America. It's also important to note that sometimes these long-standing policies, even in A items, could create large opportunities. And then the further benefits can come in from the reduced waste for perishable items, releasing capacity as well as increased sales. Now, mac and cheese did not exhibit a lot of seasonality, but in reality, many items experience non-stationary demand because of the life cycle effects, because of the seasonality, because of the customer buying patterns, or other factors. If you look at the illustration, we see a common problem that the Kraft called a landslide effect. So if you can see here, many companies experience a sudden drop in inventory and service when transitioning in from high season to a low season because they plan their safety stock based on some forward-looking rules of thumb. Now, these targets pick up the low season prematurely, causing the safety stock levels to drop, resulting in very poor service during the transition period. So for instance, in the case of Kraft Heinz, they used to see service levels drop from 99% to 60% during the transition for a very short period. But right around the high season, you can also see that the inventory is built before it is needed, right here. And this also creates a lot of savings opportunities. So we have to be careful what type of policies we need to employ when you're faced with the non-deterministic demand. Now, in order to get the planners over the psychological hurdle of letting an algorithm do what used to be their job, many years ago, we decided to implement the limits, or we call it bumpers, in the software to be able to manage the safety stock targets. Planners, they could specify an upper and lower bound on a limit. And this can be done either in absolute units or days of supply. If the algorithm produced the target outside of these limits, the software would automatically round up, round down to the values, and also raise an alert to the planner so that they can watch this out. Some planners initially set their limits tightly around the old target, but as they saw the algorithms producing reasonable results, they gained confidence in the approach over time. And then finally, they gradually widened those limits towards the real optimum. So, we had the tools to manage the transition when you're faced with these kind of counterintuitive results. Pre-COVID, Kraft Heinz was focusing on efficiency. They were trying to stay on top of the efficient frontier that Jonathan talked about. And they were also busy with creating consensus, confidence, a lot of validation, and continuing communication in the planning community. And all of this effort was driving the adoption to the results. Now, during the COVID, the focus was on service recovery. So with the end-to-end approach, we can see that a new signal can quickly be adjusted in the upstream buffers. And Kraft Heinz achieved service levels in the mid-90s, despite some of the few disruptions they've seen. I can tell you that during that period, their peers were achieving 80s. That's a dramatic difference. Post-COVID, the focus is on mitigating the risks due to the changes in the supply and demand, as well as being able to test scenarios for robustness of some of these decisions. So at the end, no trust was lost in the system. The system adapts to changes and performs, allows users to perform what ifs. So the whole approach, the whole methodology of MEIO works well and rides us through the COVID event.
Yeah, it's a great story, Gökhan, and it gives us some sense of really what are some of those success factors, those pillars, if you will, that are needed to drive this kind of approach. And we will highlight a few here, but really the first one is around creating a culture for data-driven decisions and not gut feel. And that's built on the foundation of strong data, of process and technology, but also getting out of the mentality that you need X amount of inventory to service the request. You really need to start to let the data speak for itself. Talking about the data, then we have to ensure data accuracy, validate that for confidence building, so we create trust and confidence in the numbers. And we also learn how to start to bootstrap. So we're not always going to have all of the data. We've got to account for some of those missing variables, but build that relentless commitment to the accuracy and the validation of the data from day one and set some expectations around that. As you heard, there's a big change management to this aspect. This is cross-functional. We need to make sure there's enough attention given to change management, typically done through over-communicating, getting closer to the user community. And one of the things we hear is having an open door to criticism so that we can really target what's not working well and fix that quickly. And also, give people the time to digest. We're going through a new process. This is new results coming out. If they're not intuitive at first, you've got to give people time to buy in. And ultimately, the critics become the biggest proponents going forward. And of course, there has to be some ingredients for a successful implementation, strong support from a steering team, having an effective governance structure, leadership, and also finding those critical few subject matter experts early to develop the business requirements, build alignment, become the natural champions and change agents. And once everyone has that we focus on the execution, we meet our commitments, and kind of use that teamwork approach to be successful.
Right, Jonathan, thanks for this. Before we go to the next third step of the roadmap, I got a question with a lot of likes from the audience, and maybe relating to the MRP thing we just discussed earlier. Question, what is at the heart of the solution? Is it Monte Carlo-like simulations, mathematics, smart heuristics, deep learning, reinforcement learning, a combination of the above? maybe some clarification. What is at the heart, Gökhan?
Okay, I'll take that.
Topic. We've only got 30 minutes left, Gökhan.
So the optimization solver is a dynamic programming solver. It's a nonlinear stochastic solver that is purpose-built for scalability and also complex network. Within the solution, we use a number of methodologies to adapt to the demand as well as to improve the user experience. And these are namely machine learning techniques on the calculation choices. We run statistical tests on the back end to qualify the best solution possible. And it's all about exception-based planning, which is something we're going to talk about next. So that there's also some learnings there.
Okay. So then maybe we should go to the next.
Yeah, definitely. So moving forward, we find that the current inventory practices and working processes don't support necessarily this move towards now a higher maturity, higher benefit approach, or actually account for making inventory a core competency. And one of the reasons for that is that currently many roles today are structured along the business process, which may be demand, planning, inventory, production, scheduling. And so what we see in the future is that the planners are going to become more analysts, and they're going to evolve from a domain focus that you see on the left-hand side to a focus more on the products and the customers. So we start to see them shift from what we class as the masters of discipline to the masters of orchestration, which is actually a good thing because it's a much more exciting and rewarding role. And this is a journey that begins to kind of evolve your supply chain to provide that end-to-end collaboration and achieve this single customer experience. So now the role of the MEIO and the supply chain analysts evolves to leverage a true digital model with intelligent master data to support the MEIO process. And Gökhan, I think you've got a bit more on that here now.
Yeah, so Jonathan, as you said, we do recognize that the inventory optimization and management, it needs to evolve beyond the current view that this is a necessary business cost to a key driver that should be really in sync with the business strategies that we talked about, as well as being able to incorporate the latest operational constraints and the conditions that the businesses face right now. So for instance, right now, securing the supply is a theme that we very much care for. In other words, we see our platform not only capable of delivering tactical inventory targets, but also guide for a number of scenario and sensitivity analysis at the same time, using the most up-to-date data in the digital twin. We could currently have near real-time connections, eliminating the need for data manipulation. So if you step back, in the current environment, on-demand updates with the latest master data, being able to handle the excess inventory that we talked about, being able to rationalize the deployment for that, applying potentially segmented policies on availability, reducing the lead times, by figuring out where is the optimum push-pull boundary. These are all the types of capabilities which captures really our shift to position inventory properly as a strategic weapon while reducing the cost. So in that view, the scenario simulations become automatic, they're intelligent, they include sufficient analytics to make an informed decision. And really, the inventory management also is moving from something that is, cadence-based to a much more of a continuous event-driven planning. And it's worth mentioning that exception-based logic really drives out the complexity in the global complex networks around the MEIO targets. So we're using extensive set of filters in master data and transactional data to be able to automate the target management process. We perform corrections using the limits that we talked about, as well as making corrections on outliers, bias, lead time, as well as other operational inputs. Now, the targets without the exceptions would be automatically accepted by the system. Here, again, the platform learns from the user input and then potentially doesn't bring up the same exceptions again and again. As I mentioned, we're embedding AI and machine learning to the user processes. So it's an evolving practice, it's an evolving capability.
Yeah, so quite a bit of change, Martin, from how we work today to how you might work in the future, but that's needed to get to that higher level of maturity and benefit. And data is something we're going to touch on in a moment, but is there any questions that come up?
Yeah, from my side, when I look back to the previous economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, a lot of CFOs came to the supply chain directors, demanding a deep cut in working capital. But nowadays, things have changed. And I think that, the CFO can't just demand a real, clean cut overall in working capital by reducing inventory. Is that right?
Very true. Very, very true. Yeah, the objectives do change quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, and I think that the computational power nowadays of systems make it now viable to run scenarios way more quickly than 10 years ago.
Yes. Yeah. That's where we are.
They do, and in fact, a common use case is where you may be requested to make a reduction in inventory, but then when you do that, tell me the impact of that before I put that into place. And that's something that we can achieve with this process, so that, as you say, people are making informed decisions around the data they have in front of them.
All right, let's get to the stage of the data. It's a messy topic, but it has to be dealt with.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It does. And the good thing is that this is something that comes up again and again, and we think we're getting better at it all the time. But any discussion here needs to address the question of the data. And as I say, it's something we see in every journey. And for years we've been talking about this, but we've been talking about the element of people, process, and technology. But now more and more people understand that we have to insert data into that discussion as well. And actually, we are seeing a good trend here, which is where supply chain organizations are becoming much more responsible and accountable for owning the end-to-end supply chain data. They understand it most, and they understand how to use it in the most effective way. So that's something that's growing, because typically this has been overlooked and underfunded. And the reality is that without ensuring we've got the right data, it's very hard to operate an effective process. So that's a critical element. It helps us achieve some of that autonomous efficiency aspects that we've been talking about, and it's a key enabler. But the good thing is, in advances in integration techniques and analytics are really helping us here. And Gökhan, you've got a couple examples of that.
Yeah, Jonathan, we absolutely recognize the criticality of this in the optimization. And again, it's important to simplify the process for the users. So, in our platform, the alert form summarizes really any deviations between the digital twin assumptions and the actual performance of the real supply chain. In this example, we're looking at the deviations for specific origin destination transport in terms of the lead time, assumed lead times versus the observed lead times. And the alerts that pops up for the users really takes them to a very specific lead time deviation analytic. And their user can now sort out, filter the details. They can identify the main cause for the deviation, which in this case, you probably can't see, but it is planned to a regional DC and sea transportation. And maybe this is because of the container shortage that we're experiencing right now. So, but at the end, we have the option to auto-correct this data in the digital twin, as well as optionally edit it before the autocorrection. So the users still have a control over this. And once the lead times are updated, the latest inputs are automatically aligned across the digital twin for accurate modeling, not only for inventory, but also for the supply plans, supply models. And if needed, we can also update back the ERP system if required, so the MRP can run more effectively. Now, often the level of review is reduced through time, while we improve the efficiency on data maintenance with these kind of intelligences being built. Another key assumption when optimizing the inventories relate to the configure to order products. Now, the assumptions about the bill of material over the planning horizon can impact the key component stocks as well as the final availability of the configured products at the end. The BOM composition, of course, this may change over time. Consumers may have different preferences on the types of accessories or the gadgets they want to buy, or even the color. So perhaps I may want to review this variation before committing to updating the digital twin. We even see variations at the regional levels, and that's entirely possible. We've seen this again and again. So the analytics can also help here to make sure that the accurate assumptions are captured so that the calculated buffers depict the upcoming requirements properly. And as we clean up the data to calculate inventories, we could sometimes step back and try to understand the root causes, the main drivers of why do we need to carry the stock. Usually the main culprit, as we know in this community, are the variabilities. But the length of the supply chain also plays here. And then the question is, how do we basically allocate these variabilities into the buffers and where? But we have a much more accurate view of this. The inventory drivers, the costs are calculated in the platform for each item in the planning window, and typically to help with the prioritization of the improvement efforts that Jonathan talked about. I worked in the past with organizations in a deep Six Sigma culture, and they find this kind of information very valuable in order to prioritize the improvement initiatives. So let's take a look at some of the key drivers. Now, we can see that from the top down, the safety stock can be broken down to reasons such as demand variability or lead time uncertainty, or frequency of replenishment, including capacity utilization. So there are a number of key drivers. Why do we have the safety stock? There's one thing here that is probably novel for you. That's what I call the early arrival stock. And this also happens because of the variabilities. In some industries like chemical industry, this is a big deal because you may have a ship coming in, and if you don't have enough space in your tank, guess what? The early arrival stock is gonna be sitting there, waiting in the ship, locking up the resources. So some of these key drivers are important to understand, and they are driven by different inputs. It's important to recognize that.
Yeah. I think we've really evolved the discussion with some of the techniques that we can do now around data acquisition and transfer, but then also using the deeper analytics to help us observe where the issues are and kind of bring those to the fore.
All right. Before we get to the final stage of our roadmap, step 5, I get 2 questions, but I think one is suited right here. Question: how do you handle new product introductions? They typically come with lack of historical data. Will this be handled by humans, or so will there be some assistance? So how do you handle new product introductions?
That's a great question. If I can take that, Jonathan.
Sure.
Statistically speaking, we have ways to cluster items into similar groups based on the attributes, and we do perform a set of analysis on what kind of demand we will see and when that demand is gonna be mature versus end of life. So there's an estimation in terms of how that demand is going to look like and what kind of variability we're going to see based on the data from the similar items in our tool. And also then there is a take on what kind of service level you need to attach to these items, and based on your margin information, based on some other cost and incentives that you can think about. So in the inventory management, we can basically break apart the product life cycle and have very different segmented policies executed against it. And as soon as we have some real data, we can update those values. So it becomes automatic.
Yeah. I think as well, Gökhan, there's just a natural uncertainty to when you launch a new product. So we've got a case study coming up in the soft goods apparel industry where we talk about the postponement technique, and that's certainly another one that would be of use here.
Right. Yeah, I got another question, but I will reserve it for later. Jonathan, you should share your presentation again, I think.
Yeah.
And then we get to the final stage of our roadmap.
Oh, sorry.
And then we get to the Q&A. So
I didn't realize that it dropped.
No, yeah, but and I think Gökhan, maybe to extend the discussion, but I think that the system can recognize certain patterns from the past, but also if you talk about your plans for promotions, for introductions, I think that you have a better understanding to ask to your sales and marketing people what are the things you are going to do, and is it less or more than in the past, and that you can take it into account for your scenarios, isn't it?
That's true. That's true. And I think it really needs to be coordinated, and it really needs to be figured out whether that type of a demand needs to be catered from safety stock or not. So, and even when we actually process the data, do we include promotions in it or not? So we're kind of careful about how we treat promotion demand, whether in the inventories or in the forecasting process.
So, Jonathan, here's the final stage before we get to the highway of inventory optimization.
Yeah. So we're bringing it all together now, and let's reflect for a moment, because at the beginning of the presentation we talked about some of the truths around MEIO, and we said that success has some requirements, and we've tried to go through those, but in the end we find large gains from this, and some unique ways to approach various supply chain problems in different industries. And regardless of the industry, these concepts excuse me, these concepts are widely applicable. So let's look at some of the we've used to solve that. Did we lose the slide again?
Yeah, we lost the slide there, Jonathan.
Should be.
All right. Well, I mean, in these COVID days, we've seen a lot of companies trying to rationalize their portfolio. And when we think about this, we immediately think about the finished goods. But it's also common to look at the rationalizations at the bulk level or at the recipe level. Here's a simplified version of a cereal manufacturing. On the left-hand side, we have ingredients and the production of the bulk cereal. Initially in two slightly different flavors, one with a bit more vanilla and sugar, the other one is more bland, which is what I like. The bulk is then packaged at a co-packer with fruits and cartons and all the other packaging raw materials. And the finished goods finally gets distributed in network. The triangles you see here, they depict the safety stock positions as well as the operational constraints for things like campaign production. Now, what if we were to use a common bulk, meaning a single flavored base cereal? The results show that the impact of reduction in safety stock is happening because we are now able to pool the demand variability from two flavors into one. But there's also an added benefit because the kind of bulk, the base bulk is slightly cheaper than this other one. We see a minor drop in all kinds of inventories, including in-transit stock. So it's important to understand the impact on the cost on the inventory investment end to end, and it's really easy for us to be able to run these kind of scenarios once we have the data in the digital twin. Now, sometimes we find some unlikely opportunities in industries that I would call maybe they lag in terms of optimization. One such example is from the apparel industry. Here, the optimized buffering is used in order to increase the agility and the responsiveness that we talked about. So if you look at the example, we have raw material, fabric, and other stuff at the supplier. They're being cut, stitched, and washed. We have the final product, and the final product then moves from the suppliers to the DCs, and they get stocked there for the customer sales. Now, initially, all inventory is in the finished goods, and this really makes it harder to respond to changes in demand. And all manufacturing is done by the suppliers, and really there is no other intermediate inventory. But if you look at after optimization now, we can see that the stock is held at less differentiated form, and this helps us really buffer against the potential risk or changes in the demand. Suppliers now holding fabric, they also hold stitched goods in work in process inventory, and they also have packaged finished goods inventory sitting at their DC. Now, this in turn reduces the exposure to the DCs while reducing the replenishment lead times for the final packaged goods that are customer facing. So, in case we have a new product launch and we're not 100% sure about, what kind of demand we're going to be uptake, we can leave the inventory in a less differentiated form like this. And, these kind of situations really helps us reduce the obsolescence risk, which is a big issue in the soft goods, as well as giving us a lot of agility and all kinds of gains.
Can I comment on that? Because I know that Bestseller is a customer of yours, and they use this kind of model to even look into the capacity of their contract manufacturers in Turkey and Italy to do the washings of their jeans and changes, depending on the demand in certain areas or for certain color of washings.
That's right. That's right, Martin. This is exactly the case.
All right, thank you. Next, go ahead.
Now, if you look at the durables industry, now you face a lot of stiff competition. Companies want to increase their product options. They want to add accessories and diversify the offering. Now, invariably, all of this increase the lead time to customer. So the question is it possible to reduce the lead time while offering more options? And if so, at what cost can we do that? And what is the, where is the sweet spot to execute this? Now, let's look at a numerical example from the furniture industry. It's a busy graph, but what we see on the x-axis is the order lead time to the customer by day. And on the y-axis, we have a number of safety stock positions as well as the inventory investment on stock. So at point 1, where we see the initial inflection point, we are able to reduce the order lead time from 4 weeks to 3 weeks. And this doesn't really require a lot of safety stock increase. And the reason for that is because most of the components can be supplied within the 3 weeks window. So in the optimization itself, there's also a coordination of availability from a supply perspective. At point 2, we are looking at a 1 week order lead time. And of course, we have to increase now the safety stock positions as well as the amount of investment, in this case, 20-30%. We can also see that the structure of the inventory changes. We have more sub-assembly, more work in process, and also higher amount of raw materials and components. But I will tell you, this is a very, very disruptive proposition. Being able to commit and deliver in 1 week versus a norm in the industry, which is 4 weeks, is bound to grab market share. Let's make no mistake about that. Final example is from an international distribution. Now, again, this is a hard goods distribution. This particular example is from South Africa. This company has a number of DCs in South Africa, to serve not only the local market, but also the demand in Africa. Now, a number of these DCs are set up in close proximity in Johannesburg, and they all get replenished directly from the supplying plant. Now, immediately we can think that, hey, why don't we set up a main hub in maybe Johannesburg, pull the requirements into the single node, and we are able to reduce the lead times to other connected DC. Granted, this will have a lot of benefits that are obvious, but this will require a system change, and also, we may need to perform a number of physical updates in the logistic capabilities. And this is one of those long-term initiatives that Jonathan talked about. But what about creating virtual pools for the DCs in the vicinity? So this doesn't require a master data change. We do have benefit from the pooling. And as we execute these kind of policies, we're looking at reductions in inventory in the order of 30%. Same type of arrangements as long as the customer expectations are met. Jonathan?
Thanks, Gökhan. So when all said and done, what we're showing here is really Agility is providing this holistic inventory platform focused on outcomes. The outcomes can vary, but they essentially represent the starting point of any journey. And then we rely on the organization to remove obstacles. We create cross-functional practices that, as you've seen, are really leveraging data in new ways. And then using analytics in the platform, we can help measure success and zoom in on some of those problem areas. And finally, obviously, we need to recognize the importance of effective governance and change management to help drive the organization forward. So, Martin, that's where we finish. I know we've got a couple of minutes left, and happy to take more Q&A.
Yes, I know we go to the Q&A right now. And, if your question hasn't been answered, in the next 3 minutes, you can go into the lounge after this, and in the next 30 minutes, Jonathan, Gökhan, and myself will be available sitting at the tables, and we'll be able to answer it if we know the answer. Question from the audience: can you discuss how multi-echelon inventory optimization calculated inventory targets are integrated to existing Logility products, IP, RP, and SP? Gökhan?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same platform, same data being shared across these functional capabilities. It's, I would say, a rather seamless approach when it comes to multi-echelon inventory optimization. The demand data is passed from our demand optimization. We keep track of the master data. It gets integrated and flow in from the ERP systems. Typically, we do maintain some of the master data in the application in itself. And the targets typically go into the supply planning, and in some cases into the manufacturing planning as well. So yeah, it does happen magically.
A question from my side. You see a lot of systems, platforms are using open APIs, being able to extract data from existing systems like ERP or other systems way more easily. Is it also something that you are going to extract data from, possibly from your customer side or your supplier side, so outside your own company? Gökhan?
Yeah, I mean, we have our own integration capabilities. It's a template approach to the main ERP as well as the APS systems, known SAP Oracle. But we're also started working with Microsoft on their Azure platform, OSCP. So there are a number of options here that we could be looking at.
But do you foresee that the injection of more external data from outside your company, somewhere in the supply chain, will be useful also to enhance this MEIO concept?
Yes, it will. I mean, at the end, we are trying to capture the realities and making sure that the digital twin reflects those realities. So the data could be all over the place. I mean, now we're looking at the extended supply chain, right? The companies have more and more external partners, the co-packers, co-manufacturers are working with. And this is critical to drive out the costs. And we need to be able to measure what they're doing and essentially plug in that data as well to be able to plan better. For sure, yes.
Yeah. There are still way more questions, but you know, you are already on the hour. So I would suggest that everybody who wants to talk further about this topic to either one of us or among each other, among the attendees, go to the lounge. So in the final slide, you will see that next week we'll have another webinar that will be about supply chain risk and resilience. So same time, also on a Wednesday at 4 o'clock. We will have a webinar about supply chain risk and resilience, and we have a professor, you know, who has done a survey in Europe about it, and we have a supply chain startup about supply chain resilience, looking into the supply chain using social media and algorithms. With this, Jonathan, Gökhan, I would like to thank you, and I would like to invite you to the lounge, and hopefully we will see each other there, and also other attendees. You can join us. So I'll take a break. Jonathan and Gökhan, thank you, and see you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the discussion. Thanks to the audience.
So now you can go to the lounge.